Hey, Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom, Shabbat, Shalom, all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Rakakwadash, the honors, and to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth and citations, to the sincere Akim and Aqua to listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Brother Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will as always an edifying lesson. And excuse me. For today's lesson, I kind of wanted to go through um, the meaning of grinding and what grinding actually goes back to, the ancient understanding of grinding, because the scriptures talk about how the grinders cease because they are few. So I kind of want to get an understanding and bring out some understanding in regards to what grinding is, the ancient meaning of that, and how that interruption or that ceasing or that cessation, right, is occurring today, right? So, as a matter of fact, let me just get the word ceasing or cessation. So cessation essentially is an interruption, a ceasing, abdication. It says a delaying, ceasing, tarrying, to delay, right? So what's going on is a cutting back of certain activities today, right? So let me get an understanding. Let's go and get an understanding first of what grinding is. So this all kind of like ties in together, right? But let's go into how were things in the ancient times in regards to this practice known as grinding. So I'm going to go and reference a handy book here. It's called Manners and Customs of the Bible by J.M. Freeman, right? So this is let's see what page. This is page 939, and it's basically discussing the mill. So what you see, you'll see that on the screen here, right? The mill. So here it says the ordinary hand mill of the East consists of two circular stones from 18 inches to 2 feet in diameter and about 6 inches deep. So you had the lower, or also known as the nether, is sometimes, though not always, of heavier and harder stone than the upper. So it says the upper and the right, also known as the rider, is slightly concave and covers like a lid of a vessel the lower, which is convex, right? As a matter of fact, um, let's get an understanding of those words here. So con means with, right? So here it says convex means curved like a circle or sphere when viewed from the outside, right? Vaulted or arched, right? So, and then concave, because you can Google this. This is they normally make how do you call those things, mirrors like this. So concave means to be incurved, hollowed, arched, vaulted, curved, to swell. So right, so pretty much. All right, let me get a just for edification, right? Get all those. So one would be so concave essentially is it's basically kind of like a C, and the convex, it's basically kind of rounded out, so to speak, right? It's rounded out. It's rounded outwards. Concave is inwards. Right? Just to get an understanding of what these words actually mean, right? So, moving further, it says. So here it says, hold on, where was I? Near the edge of the upper stone is the perpendicular stick or the handle by which it is turned. And at the center of the hole is a hole, for the pivot, also for the grain to fall through upon the stone below. The lower stone has a projection on the part of the edge 2 to 3 inches long, slanting downward, and hollowed as the carrying of the meal. Right, so the grinding portion, so let's get into that here. So this is kind of going into the essentially the contraption. One is kind of shaped outward and one is actually shaped inward. Right, so let's get into the grinding. So the grinding portion, it says the work of the grinding meal is usually performed by the women and is very laborious. So laborious meaning essentially laborious on the body, basically. Right, so it says sometimes one works alone, but usually two work together, sitting on the ground, which the millstones between them, both taking a hold of the handle and moving it entire around and from them. The usual time of grinding is in early dawn, so basically in the morning, or else at the evening in preparation for the following day. The stones, as they crush the grain, sending forth a grating sound, which, though not very musical in itself, it's melodious enough to a hungry traveler. So it gives you some precepts what to reference. So lower down here, it says the women who ground were among the families of wealth, either slaves or the lower servants. Right, so here it says the millstones were considered considered so important, necessary part of the household furniture that the Mosaic law would not allow them to be pawned. Right, so then it references Deuteronomy 24. Right, so I'm reading this to show that this grinding was a symbol. It was essentially a symbol of how things operated in the ancient times in regards to what's it called, an economy. It shows that back in the ancient times, so that's how you're able to tell that an economy essentially is thriving. You have a space, you have a countryside, a nation that is essentially thriving. Right, it's a symbol of, okay, there is work, and then you have people out there who are performing certain duties. Right, and that's another thing also. You had women back then that actually were performing these particular duties rather than selling their box. But that's another lesson for another day. But the point really is, it was a symbol of economy. It was a symbol of a thriving society because you actually had people performing those necessary duties. Right, now, how does this play out today, you might wonder. Okay, so the thing is, what we see today is essentially that grinding. You start to see an interruption. You're seeing a cessation of what we would call grinding today. It's like, people in the world say that, I'm on my grind, I'm grinding, to get that money, what I'm saying. But with the rise of all this new technology, tariffs, economic turmoil, you're starting to see essentially a cessation of that grinding. It's no longer in effect as smoothly as it used to be. It's starting to see that jobs are being lost. Right, because we know that the scriptures talk about how the earth is essentially given in the hands of the wicked, because the type of people who are ruling this society is essentially somebody who is very, very greedy. You're looking at the way the society is run, and there's always a plethora of different protests going on in regards to wages, in regards to contracts, in regards to work. It's becoming a lot more contingent. It's not never anything concrete. Right, so I'm kind of transitioning to kind of like play it out, but I'm kind of sticking on the theme of grinding in more modern context. Right, today you have people who perform certain duties, who take care of your garbage, they take care of your work, They take care of, trimming the grass, raking the leaves, keeping the sewers clean, driving the trucks. Those are symbol of modern day terms, what we would call grinding. Hearing those things, the blaring of the truck, dropping off certain skids. You hear the lawnmowers cutting the grass. Sooner or later you're gonna have less and less of these things occurring because the society, is moving towards a very technological route where a lot of people are end up now in these times losing their jobs, right? So, um, what I want to do, I want to read Ecclesiastes 12 where it discusses this, and I'm just gonna jump around just to hit a couple points here and there. And I sincerely pray that this lesson is edifying, right? So this is Ecclesiastes 12, and I'll start at verse 1 because this is a good point here. Um, it says, "Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, when the evil days come not, and nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them, when while the sun or the light or the moon or the stars be not darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain," right? So, this is a good time essentially when you start to see, these economic downturns um, are occurring. It would behoove you Israelites, you know, you so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans, to come back to the Heavenly Father, and you speckled birds also, to come back to the Lord because, we need essentially a protection, a protector, in these times because the scriptures talk about how Jacob essentially is a worm, to roughly paraphrase. And a worm, when you think about it, a worm is very, very defenseless. It doesn't have, claws, it doesn't have teeth, it doesn't have a stinger, it doesn't have any sort of like mechanisms to be able to defend themselves, or skin to kind of like, to guard against, different, what's it called, perils, different dangers, you know. This is verse 3, and it says, "In the day the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall bow themselves, and the grinders cease, because they are few, and those that look out of the windows be darkened," right? So what's going on in this society now, you start to see essentially a lot of people are not working as much as they used to. You have a lot of countries that are expanding a lot on their immigration policies, and that also is contributing into a lot of grinding ceasing because these nations, these leaders of these nations are bringing in an influx of different immigrants, and it's causing a rift. It's causing a, essentially, as the scriptures describe, an Egyptian against the Egyptian, because you have people who have been in countries for quite a bit of time. I'll just use Canada as an example. Then you have an influx of immigrants coming in, where there's a lot of people that are finding it a lot harder to find particular jobs now. Tariffs. That's another thing also with this the orange pylon that's running the United States. This individual here, is slapping a lot of tariffs a lot on these other nations, and causing a rift between a lot of the nations that are that they're very, very close to. So, for example, Canada, Mexico, China, and what's it called? The EU nations, right? So, and all that is prophecy, right? Because scriptures say that the 10 horns shall hate the whore, right? So you start to see all these different things, these tariffs, is starting to cause a cessation of work. People are not working, grinding as much as they used to. You're starting to see a lot of layoffs because of these things, and companies have to lay off people because, what Trump is essentially wanting to do is to basically get a lot of these companies to move their businesses into the US to establish and have their businesses there. And what does that do? It causes a lot of countries where that company had moved from, they lose their jobs, right? and then you have a lot of people who are essentially um, being oppressed, because of these tariffs, right? So you start to see an example, going back to the title, a grinding ceasing, the noise that is coming from, these different, this mechanism here. You don't see a lot of people, especially like in blue collar work, because that's kind of what this is. It's essentially like a blue collar style of work where it requires like physical manual labor, right? That's an important element of a thriving society, right? What happens when you do that grinding? Grinding is grinding the grains. So the grains can be used to essentially be to be made into bread, right? And that is one of the principal things of a man's life, because this man is so greedy, as a matter of fact, let's go to the Apocrypha just to transition just a little bit. Let's go to, what is that? Okay, this is Sirach chapter 14, verse 3. And it says, riches are not comely for a niggard. And what should an envious man do with money? He that gathereth by defrauding his own soul gathereth for others. He that shall spend his goods riotously. Right? So Esau is the type of person, he's really and truly the original niggard, because what's happening in this society right now is essentially he is hoarding a lot of the resources for himself. And I'll give you a good example of that. A few months ago, back, I believe it was in February or March or whenever, when the LA had all those fires, and there were a lot of celebrities that lost their homes. So now there were firefighters in California that they were being paid absolutely peanuts. That's number one. But the point I really wanted to hit was the fact that back then, when they were having those fires, there was a company that was hoarding a lot of the water for themselves, right? It was a company owned by some ish people that did not, use the resources wisely, because this is an example of people who are niggards, because they believe in commodifying everything, the natural things, the essential things of a man's life. As a matter of fact, let me get that, because I'm mentioning bread and water. So this is, bear with me, because these things are very, very important. This is Sirach chapter 39, verse 26. And it says, the principal things for the whole use of man's life are water, fire, iron, and salt, flour of wheat, honey, milk, and the blood of the grape, and oil, and clothing. All these things are good to the godly, so our sinners are turned into evil, right? So these people hoarded all these resources for themselves, and they did not have the mindset to be able to distribute and actually use those resources wisely. They're just a bunch of people who are just foolish. Let me go to, I'm jumping around here in Sirach. Let me just as a matter of fact, let me go to Proverbs. 1 second. This is Proverbs chapter 29, verse 2, and it says, for when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn. And this is exactly why the people are mourning, because, you're being ruled over by somebody who is not only hoarding a lot of the resources for themselves, but they don't know how to manage it and care for it properly. That's why in the kingdom it's going to be actually be able to be managed properly, because we be actually be issuing forth those things according to the law. The law is going to be actually be the thing, the standard of how life should be, right? The scriptures say that the multitude of the wise is in the welfare of the world, right? Because there are certain resources, like for going back, for example, when you go back to um, the grinding portion, it takes what Esau does. I'll just could do this comparison this way. What Esau does, he he um, he strips the certain parts of the grain, right, and makes a different type of flour called so-called refined flour, as opposed to the natural flour, the whole wheat flour, is more beneficial, because in that with that whole wheat flour, what you get is a more rounded out nutrient profile, as opposed to a more carbohydrate filled profile of what Esau produces, right? His practices of how he actually produces things, it essentially it strips away the important nutrients that you need, right? And other practices known as the land Sabbath, those particular practices are not actually implemented in this society to actually make sure these things are being ran properly, right? So he's a king that is absolutely foolish. The scriptures say that an unwise king destroyeth his people, and one of the methods he does so is by not paying the people properly. There's a certain time that people need to be paid, going back into the law, right? And then there is you have to honor certain ordinances, right? So these are things that oppress you. I'm kind of jumping around here and there, but I kind of wanted to, since I'm in the topic of bread and grinding and ceasing, this is let's go to, I just want to hit two more, because this is the time that we live in, right? Because this is what happens when things become more difficult in a society where you're constantly being pushed and oppressed. um, this is 2nd Ezra 15 and 19, and it says, a man shall have no pity upon his neighbor, but shall destroy their houses with a sword and spoil their goods, because of the lack of bread and for great tribulation. So you start to see more of a more animalistic side of people coming out, as the scriptures say that the love of many shall wax cold, right? When things start to become more difficult, with all these different tariffs, right? So um, I guess I'll end off with this last one here, just to show the perks of actually being righteous in these times. This is Psalms 37 and 25, and it says, I have been young, and now I'm old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, nor seed begging bread, right? So there's perks in actually exemplifying a righteousness, because then you have essentially like a spiritual bank account to tap into when these things, famine, lack of resources start to happen, that grinding, ceasing starts to happen, right? Like, for example, during the time of that famine during the reign of King Ahab, you had the prophet Elijah. He went into a widow's, essentially it was like an inn, and he was actually fed, right? And he was the Lord commanded the ravens to feed him, right? So it shows you the importance of actually exemplifying righteousness. And it also shows you that we'll need a lot of miracles in these times, right? To see, because you start to see how that grinding is ceasing, right? Slowly. You're not going to have a lot of people performing a lot of duties as they normally would, like the regular everyday services that you might think of. So, um, I guess I'll leave it there, but I sincerely pray and hope this lesson was edifying. I was kind of just jumping around different, talking points here and there, trying to get a more ancient biblical understanding of what grinding is, how that grinding ceasing is still playing out, and that's playing out today, right? And then showing you the importance of actually having the law and actually having the things done properly in the ancient way, respecting the way the Lord did things, right? Set things up and how things were supposed to be and how things should be, right? So, um, I've rambled on quite a bit, but I sincerely pray this lesson was edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Shai. Until next time, I say Shabbat Shalom.